This is Winchester Academy.
And for our speaker, our Professor Christenson was born right next door in Amherst, Wisconsin, graduate of University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, and a master's degree in medicine in library science. He organized and directed the Traverse des Sioux Regional Library System in Minnesota and was executive director there for 30 years. And in 1987 named Minnesota Librarian of the Year. He and his wife have visited several Civil War sites, including ones that were occupied by the Waupaca Company 1 of the Scandinavian Regiment, where his great-great-uncles served. So he had a special interest to that. On a personal note, I'm actually standing in for Pat Hollenbeck, who was a friend of John's mother, and I heard a story about John. I was told that a neighbor saw him walking down the street one day, just sort of walking slowly, and the neighbor asked him, "John, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just wondering." And he's been wondering ever since. So welcome to John Christenson.
Thank you. I don't remember that story. My mother has a lot more interesting stories that I'm glad she didn't tell anybody. Well, welcome. And this is the largest group I've talked to in a long time, because I've been retired for about 10 years. And I've always been interested.
Can you speak a little louder? Or
Sure.
mic?
Oh, okay. Can this mic be turned up?
We're not going to get it piped through our overhead speakers.
Okay? Yeah. Hey! Just about this distance? Okay. Well, the genesis of this talk was when I was asked to give the history of the town of Good Thunder by the Boy Scout troop. And it just so happened that my son was a Cub Scout, and he had just joined the Boy Scout troop, and I had been mayor of the town of Good Thunder for a couple of years at that time, and I ended up being a mayor for 14 years. I started asking people about the history of the town. The town was only 560 people, but it was in an area that had been part of a Winnebago Ho-Chunk reservation. And I had heard that it might have been named after Dakota or a Winnebago, but no one was really sure. So that started me on the trail of finding out why the town was named that. And then it led me to this whole topic of the uprising or conflict in 1862 between Dakota and the United States.
Please stay closer to the mic for us old folks. Okay?
Right here?
Yeah. Thank you.
Is anybody here older than me?
We all are.
Okay. Well, we start out by looking at, let's see how it works. There we go. The largest mass execution in United States history was held on December 26, 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota. It was an event that people from all over the southern Minnesota and into Iowa came to watch. There were 38 Dakotas hanged. There were 100 1,400 soldiers grouped around, and 4,000 citizens who came to see on the day after Christmas the hanging of 38 Dakota. Let's go back to where it started. The Dakotas were known to be a peaceful tribe in the early 1800s. They had a lot of problems with Chippewas, or Ojibways, as we call them now. Those were their natural enemies. But overall, they had a pretty peaceful life up until and the same thing happened here in Wisconsin, where the whites started moving in and taking property, starting farms, taking the game and fish that the people who had lived here thought belonged to them. At that time, there were still buffalo in southern Minnesota. And it didn't last very long. It was a very, very short time. But Dakotas were still able to hunt them when they still existed. They also did a lot of ice fishing. They usually lived in teepees, and in bark huts. And during the fall and into the winter, they lived in the teepees because that's when they were hunting. And they would take their teepees out and then set them up in a convenient place where they found a lot of game. But you don't see, when you see a movie about Indians, you never see a place like this. But that was more common than the teepees. They also tapped maple trees in the spring and harvested rice. This picture and some of the others was a watercolor that was done by a commander of Fort Snelling, whose name was Seth Eastman. And he was the commander in the early 1840s, and at that time, there wasn't a lot going on. And he would spend most of his time out wandering around with his watercolors. And he collected scenes of the Indians, and this was just before photography. So these are very, very important pictures because he really detailed what they were doing and what they were wearing and how they worked. Do you know what they're doing here? They're not fishing, they're killing muskrats. And then over to the right here is a quarter, a man who is interested in the maiden in the background, and he has his flute out and is playing music. There it is. I was missing the page of notes. I'm missing the second page. I have this map to show you the geographic area. So when I talk about places like Acton or Fort Snelling, you know where they are.
John, you might have to point out because we can't read the fine print. I guess you got to point.
Okay, this is Fort Snelling. This is the Mississippi River running through here, and here's the Minnesota River, which starts here. The Minnesota River begins at Big Stone Lake and then runs down to Mankato, and then it goes north, unlike most other rivers. The Winnebago tribe had a reservation over here. There were 3 forts: Fort Snelling, Fort Ripley, and Fort Ridgely. Fort Snelling was a beautiful fort. It still is. It's up above the confluence of the 2 rivers, and it was a fort that had been very hard to attack. And after they built it in the 1850s, no one ever attacked it. But they did attack Fort Ridgely, and that was a really poor fort, and but it was only under attack at one time. This is the Dakota reservation as it ended up. It started out covering this whole area, and then it was 10 miles on each side of the Minnesota River, and then through treaty changes, it was just this area clustered along the river. And if you're interested in more details, I have copies of copies of 2 maps over here on the table. This is Little Crow. He was born near Fort Snelling in that area near St. Paul. His grandfather was a chief and entered in a lot of treaty negotiations. And his father was also a chief. He, after his father died, he wanted to take over the chiefdom, but he had 2 half-brothers who didn't want him to do that. And finally, Little Crow said, "Shoot me if you don't want me to be your leader." So they shot him. But he had his arms like this. Both his wrists were broken. But he survived. And for some reason, the 2 brothers disappeared in about a month. He was a leader of Little Crow. Tao Yate Duta was the leader of the Eastern Dakota. He was the most prominent member of all the treaty negotiations. He attended a missionary school near Fort Snelling where he learned English and reading, but he never learned to write in English. This is the Traverse de Sioux site on the Mississippi River, on the Minnesota River. The government decided that they wanted to have a really big treaty to take as much land as possible away from the Dakotas. And so they picked a site that was halfway between St. Paul and the Lower Sioux Agency. It was also a traditional area that had a very low water level, and you could walk across it. So it's called, and it has a French name, Traverse des Sioux. just at the time they were going to have a signing of a treaty, of the Traverse Sioux Treaty, it started raining and raining, and it rained so much that most of the warriors from around the state and around the area were held back. They couldn't get through. The good thing about it, in some respects, was because of all that rain, the Minnesota River went up, and so it went up high enough so steamboats didn't have a problem getting there. And that had been a problem of getting through the Mankato area and up to the Traverse Sioux area. So they were just sitting around. The government officials are just sitting around waiting for the Indians to show up. Really important business here. These drawings here and here were done by an artist from Baltimore, and he wanted to come out to see the Indians. He'd never seen Indians like this before. So he got on some steamboats, took a train to St. Louis, and got on a steamboat, came here and started doing these sketches. As there wasn't anything happening yet, the biggest event was a marriage of two mixed breeds called Nancy Winona McClure, whose father was a trader, his mother was a Dakota, and David Faribault. And there are several places in Minnesota that are named Faribault, associated with this family. And he was a trader, and he was half Dakota. She was so beautiful that she attracted a lot of attention, and there was a regular path going to her teepee to talk to her, and she sold a lot of little trinkets during that time. Well, they were married and in an Episcopalian wedding, and it was done by a clerk from the U.S. government. Something else that went on were the tremendous lacrosse games, and their rules for lacrosse weren't, and they had no rules. You could just, if you had a lacrosse racket, you could just run out and pick your side, and if you thought that one side had more and it would probably win, that's probably where you'd end up. And so they went back and forth, and sometimes they had as many as 250 players. So it was pretty exciting. And then to do something different, they had games where just the women and girls played, which hasn't happened here for a long time. It's something new. And this is a sketch of a young brave named Good Thunder, Waupaca, and I can tell you more about him later. But he was an excellent ball player. That's what it says on the side. Because of the rain, there were more mosquitoes and gnats than usual. And so when these warriors had their meal, they also had a lot of things to bat the mosquitoes and gnats with. That looks like a palm leaf to me, but they wouldn't have palm leaves in that area. It was some other kind of leaf. Finally, the time arrived for the signing of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux of July 1851. The delegates gathered, and the treaty was translated. Up until that time, it hadn't been translated into Dakota. Each chief was asked to sign 2 copies of the treaty. At that time, most of the chiefs weren't able to write. They used an X, and then the trader would pencil in or put in an arrow going to the name that they thought that person had. The worst thing that happened was, here are the 2 officials signing the treaty with the Indians as they came up, the Indian chiefs. One of them was named Lee, and his brother was Albert Lee. You all heard of Albert Lee? His name was Luke Lee, and the other person was the territorial governor of Minnesota. Well, after they'd signed these treaties, they were led over to this table, and this is the traders' table, and they were asked to sign it. Most of them who signed it, well, none of them who signed it knew what they were signing because it was in English, and they also didn't realize that they thought it might have been a 3rd copy of the original treaty. And what it was is called a trader's paper. And the traders had kept close track of what they thought each individual chief or Indian owed them. So they put it all together, and these chiefs had to sign it. They signed away $2 million worth of debts. They did have a lot of debts, but not $2 million. And it didn't become part of the official treaty because the U.S. Senate had heard about what was happening out west and decided to ban the treaty, the traders' amount in the treaty. So the traders just did it separately. Immediately after the treaty had been signed, the government decided to sell half of the reservations to the whites. The treaty itself gave the Dakotas reservations on either 10 miles on either side of the Minnesota River. The U.S. Senate, for some reason, and it's 3 years, things haven't changed a lot, but anyway, and it took them 3 years to okay this, and then they crossed out the treaty part. And so they decided that they would let the Dakotas use the treaties for 5 years and then look at it again. The money was supposed to come to on annuities of almost $3 million. Oh, the actual treaty itself was sold, all the Dakota lands, 24,000 acres, for $3 million. That turned out to be 10 cents per acre. And then they were to receive a certain amount of money every year for 50 years for the remaining part. And that was what the agreement was. By 1858, the government wanted more of that land. So they invited about 30 of the chiefs to come to Washington. And they really wined and dined them, and they took them to plays, and they gave them a lot of demonstrations of the military at the time. The U.S. Marine Band played for them, and the chiefs got up and danced to it. That would have been an interesting sight. They signed new treaties. Little Crow was there, and he objected to it. He objected strongly. He said, "You keep promising things. You keep saying we're going to get more money, but every time we meet with you, you take away some of our property. You are treating us like children." And one of the Indian agents said, "That's because you are children," which was a terrible thing to say to someone like Little Crow. So they said, again, "We see nothing but promises." And then treaty after treaty was broken. Promised funds are not forthcoming. Payments that were due in June of 1862 were not received by August. And that was a particularly bad year. It was a year when the crops had failed, and they didn't have enough food. And they went to the traders' warehouses and asked for an extension of credit. And they said, "No, we can't do that. We will when the gold arrives, when the gold arrives." They kept promising that. And by the middle of August, it hadn't happened. And the Dakotas were being squeezed. It was all headed for a tinderbox. And then the Acton egg incident happened. There were 4 braves who were really hungry, and so they decided to go out and hunt. And they went on hunting, not on a reservation, but they went off the reservation and were hunting for game and didn't find any. And as they were coming back, they found this fence with a bunch of eggs in a nest. And one of them picked up the eggs and looked at them, and another one said, "You shouldn't do that, they belong to the white man." And the first one said, "Are you afraid? Are you a coward?" And the Indian said, "No, I could go and shoot a white man." So they smashed the eggs, and they walked over to the farm. They talked to the farmers and said, "How about if we have a little game here, and we'll shoot at the target. You can shoot at the target over here, and we'll shoot at it, and whoever has the best shot will get some money, maybe some whiskey." So they went ahead. Is this still on? So they went ahead, and the white men shot at the target, and the Indians stood behind them and shot them. And this is how the whole conflict started. Well, the braves were so upset when this happened, that happened, and they did it because then they shot the rest of the people in the farm, and that included 2 women. And they knew that the whites would hang anybody like that who went out and shot white women. So they went and they got Little Crow out of bed. This was Sunday, and Little Crow had gotten up early and he had gone to church. He wasn't a Christian, but he went to the Episcopal service. That was the church that was on that Lower Sioux Agency. And he went back to bed. He had a house on the Lower Sioux Agency with a big TV next to it. And they got him up, and they told him the story of what happened. And they said, you know, this would be a good time. This would be a good time to push all the whites out. They knew that the Civil War was going on, that they hadn't seen a lot of soldiers lately because they were all out at the Civil War. And Little Crow said, the white men are like locusts. They fly so thick that the sky is like a snowstorm. If you kill 1, 2, or 10 times 10, they will still come and kill you. And he believed this. He had been to Washington several times. He had seen the demonstrations of the military might. He'd seen all these people, and he knew that the Dakotas were never going to be able to push all the whites out of Minnesota. And then the Braves, who were pretty hot-headed, started calling him a coward. And he said, he finally gave in and said that he would take up the leadership. On Monday morning of August 18th, 1862, a large party of painted and armed Dakotas went to the Lower Sioux Agency and surrounded all of the buildings. They divided themselves up into small groups. They went to the trader stores, the warehouses, barns, and a church. And this is the only building that's left out at the Lower Sioux Agency. They started shooting and killing, looting. 20 people were killed, 10 were captured, and 47 escaped. The ones who escaped were headed for the river where there was a ferry boat crossing. It's called the Redwood Crossing. This guy, Andrew Myrick, who was from Wisconsin, by the way, was the second one to be killed. Because when he went to his warehouse earlier on that week and asked if they were starving and asked them if they could have something to eat, if he would lend them, give them something from the warehouse. And he says, if you're so hungry, why don't you go out and eat grass? And Myrick and his brother had a series of trading posts around that area. In fact, they started out at Lacrosse, Wisconsin. They were founders of Lacrosse. And when Myrick heard what was happening, he was up on the second floor. He jumped out the window on top of a shed, slid down the shed, and started running for the river. He didn't get very far. He was shot 4 times with bullets, also with arrows. And when they turned him over, they saw that his mouth was full of grass. And here's what happened to Lower Sioux Agency. A new church was being built, and it was destroyed. It was on fire, and a lot of the other buildings were burned. Then the attacks by the Dakotas spread all throughout that area. And this is a group of settlers who escaped from the Upper Sioux Presbyterian Missionaries mission. And these people were all headed for Fort Ridgely, which was down past the Lower Sioux Agency. They were joined by 4 Germans, here, 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 and here. And they had been working at a sawmill, and they decided to join the party. But the party was going too slow for them. They had oxen, and they wanted to go to New Ulm to be with other Germans. And they decided to take off on their own. it didn't take very long before they were killed. In fact, the party could hear the gunfire. This fellow over here, his name was Wilson Moore, and there's his wife, Mrs. Moore. And they were from New Jersey, and they came out for their honeymoon to watch the money being dispersed to the Indians. Well, they got here just in time to join the party. So they were out here, and they were not hurt. The only other person I've heard about who came out to join to watch the dispersal was Henry Thoreau, and he came out in 1861, and that was his last major trip, was out to see the Indians. This woman here was one of Riggs' children. He had 5 of his children with him, and she was the oldest one, Martha. And she's making bread. This was about 2 in the afternoon. They hadn't had breakfast or any other food. And so she was starting to do that. It took them 4 days of traveling across the prairie, but they never ran into another group. They were aware that they were being followed, but they never were closer than when the 4 Germans left. There was one township in all of the whole area that had more people killed than any other township. It was Milford Township. It had the highest death rate, 52, of any township in the state, and most people were killed were German. A problem existed between the Dakotas and the Germans that didn't exist between the English and the French and the Dakotas, because the Germans didn't like the Indians. They didn't learn the language. Both the English and the French intermarried with Dakotas, and so they had a lot of relatives, but the Germans didn't do that. The names of all of the 50-some people are on the base of this, and this is out in a cornfield 6 miles from New Ulm. This is La Vida Eastlink, Merton and Eastlink, and Johnny Eastlink. They were from the Lake Chetek area. The rest of their family were killed. The father was shot the first time the Indians came around, and then Laverna gathered up her 5 children and started to flee. They killed 3 of the children and then shot her 4 times. She had the baby in her arms. The baby wasn't injured. So, and then she had the 11-year-old boy with her. And she gave baby Johnny to the 11-year-old boy and said, "Here, take care of him. Take care of him." And then she collapsed. She recovered and started out heading for New Ulm. And eventually, after about 3 or 4 days, she caught a ride with a postman, and he was coming from Sioux Falls, and he hadn't heard about the uprising. And he picked her up and took her to the next farm, where she was able to find some food. And then the postman took her down the road a little bit, and he encountered a group of people that Laverna knew. And she said, "Have you seen my 2 children?" And they said, "Yes, they're down the road about 2 miles. The Merton had carried the child, the baby, on his back for 50 miles. He was a real hero. The Redwood Ferry crossing was the only river crossing that was close to the Lower Sioux Agency. And a lot of the 47 who were not captured crossed on this ferry. And a few people staggered into Fort Ridgely, which was 13 miles down the river, and said there was an awful uprising going on and the soldiers better go out and put it down. So John Marsh, who was the captain there, it was a very small company, got 40 together and they got into wagons and they went up the river. And they came to this Redwood Ferry crossing. And that's the way it looked in 1862, and it's pretty much how it looks today. When John Marsh and his 47 people got there, they looked and they saw White Dog, and White Dog was what was called either a farmer Indian or a cut hair, and his hair doesn't look like it was cut. But anyway, he worked for the government and taught them how to plant and grow seeds. And he came out of the bushes and he said to Captain Marsh, "Let's have a council. Let's talk about what's happening." And then a shot rang out. And all of a sudden, from the bushes on either side, a whole bunch of Dakota warriors started shooting. And within 2 seconds, they had killed 11 of the soldiers. And John Marsh wanted to fight back, but he saw that the woods are just filled with them. They saw a lot of ponies, so they decided to go down the river to Fort Ridgely. There were a lot of bushes on either side, so they went through the bushes. They came to the end of the bushes, and at the end they could see a group of warriors. So they decided to cross the river. John Marsh was a swimmer, but by the time he was halfway across the river, he got a cramp and went under. So his role was taken over by a 19-year-old sergeant, and who gathered the remainder of the soldiers together, and they went down to Fort Ridgely and they reported what was happening. And Fort Ridgely at that time was under a lieutenant who had only been in the Army for 8 months. And he sent a message to Fort Snelling telling them what was going on, that they needed some help. Then the Little Crow gathered together about 600 of the warriors, and he decided to attack New Ulm. The burning of the buildings was done by both the Indians and the settlers. So the settlers and people in New Ulm saw that the Indians would go to the outskirts and use these buildings as a place to hide when they were shooting. So some of the buildings were burned by the Uprising, and the other by the people who lived there. At New Ulm, they gathered together all of the women and children and put them in the center of the town, in this area. And the story goes, and it's been repeated enough, so it sounds true, was that as they crowded into the buildings, the major hotel was the Dakota House. And when the women came in the hoop skirts, there wasn't enough room for everybody. So they asked the women to take their hoop skirts off and make a big pile of them behind Dakota house. And the next thing that happened was it started raining, and that raining very hard, and the Dakotas then decided to back off after burning a lot and killing several people. So then Little Crow decided that the next thing he would do would be go down to Fort Ridgely, and there's another picture of New Ulm. Fort Ridgely had no stockade around it, as most forts would have. It had, pardon? Yeah. There were ravines on 3 sides, which went directly up to the fort, and the Indians had scouted it out, of course, and they knew that. The stable was off to the side, and they decided to put it on fire so the Indians would make use of it. The magazine ammunition was off here.
Microphone.
Pardon? Okay. All right, thank you. So it was in terrible shape to be a frontier fort. Eventually, there were some replacements who came from St. Peter, and they came in, and the other secret that they had here was that they had 2 howitzers, 2 howitzer cannons, and the Indians had never seen them before. So when the howitzers started firing, and Indians were being blown up, or seeing even trees being blown up, or land being blown up, they started retreating. And that, because of that, Fort Ridgely was saved. Well, that didn't make Little Crow very happy. So he decided to go to New Ulm again, to try to really take it over. When they got to New Ulm, because of the loss of it before, Little Crow had very few supporters. So then he decided to go back to Fort Ridgely. But by this time, they had more and more volunteers coming from Mankato and St. Peter and other towns. And Little Crow didn't know that, and he led a group up to Fort Ridgely, and he was in a buggy. And he had David Faribault, who had married the Indian girl. David Crow was driving the buggy. I mean, David Faribault was driving the buggy for Little Crow. The battle went on for 4 days. But only 3 whites were killed, 13 wounded, and more than 100 braves perished during that second battle. And that then led to the Battle of Birch Coulee. A party was sent out. It was 10 days after the first people were killed on August 18th, to decide to go out and to bury them. So they went out to a place called Birch Coulee near the town of Morton, and they buried most of the bodies they could find scattered around. And then it started growing late, and so they circled their their wagons, tied up their horses behind, and only had 3 sentinels for this whole area. What happened was early next morning as the sun came up, the Indians came up out of the coulee and the horses around here and killed about 90 horses. And not too many whites this time. There's a big controversy about the help that they wanted to get from Fort Ritchie, or why it was so slow. They just didn't come. The next battle was at Woodlake. This was an interesting one because they had a lot more soldiers by that time. They were gathering them around, and they went up to a place called Woodlake, which was further up the Minnesota River. And as they were assembling there, they went out and did some marching, and they ran into a group of Indians who were waiting in ambush. And if they hadn't accidentally run into them, it probably would have been a bigger disaster. And finally, they went to Cape Release, and they have been begging Washington for a long time to send some troops, real soldiers, because most of them that they had were volunteers. And they finally got a regiment of Minnesotans, and they had been prisoners of war, and they were happy to get out of the Civil War, and they were happy to come into Indian Territory. So they brought them in at Camp Release. They arrived at the camp and took over 270 whites and mixed bloods who had been captive for at least a month. One of the captives was Mary Schwant, and her family had been killed. And, this is Good Thunder's wife. Their 7-year-old child had died just before the uprising. She said that she would like to trade her pony for any young girl that they brought in that she could take care of. So Mary Schwant was brought in, and was older, was 14 and older than her 7-year-old, but she took care of her for that whole time. She had a pit in her teepee, and she had Mary Schwant get in it and put blankets over it whenever anyone would come into the teepee. And they became very, very close. And this is a picture of the two of them. It was taken about 30 years later in St. Paul. And that's the first time they had seen each other since the uprising. And there were a lot of tears. These are two women, along with some of their children and some other children, who they were taking care of during the uprising, and they were captured, and they weren't found until November. And one of the women was down at the Minnesota River, and she heard some English, and there were some trappers there, So she went out and told the trappers that they were captives of the Indians, that they should send some help, and they did. Both of these women had been violated and were pregnant. This woman gave birth, and this one had a stillborn baby, and she, as they said in those days, she went crazy. They started having trials of the captive Dakota immediately, and they began before the camp release was over. So they began deliberations. They went through a process that speeded up the trials. Some of them went as short as 5 minutes, and when they also accused anyone who had been seen at one of the battles as a murderer. There wasn't any legal defense, and 302 prisoners were sentenced to death. Our remaining 90 received prison terms. The names were sent, just the names were sent. Abraham Lincoln had to okay this, so names were sent to Abraham Lincoln, and he said, there's no proof here. I want the whole transcript. So they did mail the whole, and he said, I want it by mail, not by telegram. And they sent it to him, and he spent considerable time reading every single one of the transcripts. And because of the difficult feeding for all who weren't sentenced, mostly women and children, they were taken to a camp just at the base of Fort Snelling. And it was a miserable experience. This is in the winter, December. And in the spring, it was right on the floodplain. In the spring it started flooding. So it was a mess. Here's Bishop Henry Whipple. Visiting the Indians at the camp. Bishop Henry Whipple was an Episcopalian who had been hired as a young man to do a mission to the railroad men in Chicago. And he was so successful at that the Minnesota diocese decided to vote to have him come to Minnesota as a bishop. And he was very charismatic, and he had written to Abraham Lincoln several times about the problems with Indians, and his opinion was it wasn't the Indian problem, it was a government problem, and that the Indian agents were corrupt. He then left the Lower Sioux area, but the first thing he did was to set up a hospital. And he worked in the hospital, and then went on to an Episcopalian convention in New York and raised money for refugees, and then got an appointment with Abraham Lincoln to talk to him. Abraham Lincoln is something I hadn't known until recently, lost his grandfather that was killed by Indians. His grandfather on his farm in Indiana was shot and killed while he was working with the corn. And not only that, but the person who shot Abraham Lincoln's grandfather also grabbed Tom Lincoln and took him and was going to take him. Tom Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's father. So if that had happened, a lot of things would be different today or during the Civil War. But Abraham Lincoln's cousin, Mordecai, shot the Shawnee who had captured Tom. And this didn't make Abraham Lincoln bitter about the Indians. It made his cousin, Mordecai, very bitter. In fact, he went out and he just shot Indians just for the spite of it. So Bishop Whipple met with Abraham Lincoln. I think that was something really good to say. So they had a long discussion, and this was in the middle of the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln had a lot of things to do. He had a whole long list of people standing out, all wanted to see him for various reasons. And the battles weren't going as well as he had hoped during the Civil War. But he talked to Bishop Whipple. Bishop Whipple wrote a paper stating that the greatest problem was the corruption in the Indian agents and needed the president to do something about that. And the president said, you know, I have a story to tell you, that someone found out that it would be cheaper to have, and more effective, to have monkeys go out and get cotton because they had smaller hands and they didn't worry about a lot of things and they would be very good cotton pickers. And Abraham Lincoln said, the problem was that the monkeys had to have 2 people at a time watching them. And we don't have enough people to watch all the corrupt agents. The prisoners who have been thought of as being guilty and others who were guilty are all brought to Mankato. And they were in danger in Mankato because there were gatherings of Mankato farmers and others who had lost relatives in the uprising. They wanted to go in and shoot all the Indians immediately and not just waste all this time. They were prevented from doing that. But in the meantime, they decided that the hanging site would be in Mankato. And here's just a recap of the map. This shows the Winnebago Reservation down here. Little Crow had gone to the Winnebago several times, and he had asked them to help in this battle. And then he went to the Ojibwe and did the same thing, and neither one of them wanted to. And if that had happened, it would have been an entirely different battlefield. And then this is the march that was made to Fort Snelling with all the women and children. The men were all marched to Mankato.
John?
Yep.
I'm sorry, we're almost out of time.
Okay. I'm at the close to the ending here.
Okay, you can wrap it up in 5 minutes. I think you're gonna have to forego Q&A.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, as it turned out, Abraham Lincoln pardoned 265, and 38 were hanged. The picture on the right shows him giving people copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issued on the same day as he had hanged 38 Indians. It's kind of an interesting point in history. On December 26, 1862, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a great cheer, 4,000 people, when the Dakotas were hanged. And the wagons there were there to carry the bodies to the Minnesota River, which was on the other side of Peace Building. And they were buried there, and they all disappeared. Because local doctors had wanted the bodies to practice on, including Dr. Mayo, who lived in Missouri at the time. Little Crow had gone to Canada, he'd gone to other places to try to recruit Indians to attack, and nothing worked out for him. So that on September 27th, he and his son were back in the region around the little Sioux agency, the lower Sioux agency. And there was a time when if you shot an Indian and was running around like that, you would get paid for it. So two farmers saw Little Crow and his son go in the field with the berries, and so shot them. They didn't know that it was Little Crow. So this is the check that they received over here from the Minnesota government. Two others, Shakopee and Medicine Bottle, had gone to Canada, and then they were drugged and brought back to Fort Snelling and hanged. And as just before Medicine Bottle was hung, he said, "We go out, and I hear the trains coming in." And the fight went on between the Dakotas and the government until the Battle of Wounded Knee on December 29th, 1890. And I'll quickly go to the end. Here's a church that was rebuilt, and here's Good Thunder in his old age, Whipple and Bishop Whipple in his old age at the dedication. And I've gone to that church several times, and it's kind of neat because they sing the songs in Dakota. And then a grain elevator was painted in Good Thunder with the image of Good Thunder on it, so he can see over the fields. His nose is about 6 feet long. And this is the last one. Every year around Christmas, people gather at the Lower Sioux Agency. All of the Dakotas and all of the Winnebagos were taken across the United States and dropped off at the Crow Creek Reservation, which was a terrible place. Many of them died, and now the ones who were there get on their horses and do this ride across. South Dakota, and Minnesota. And this is where they end up, at this statue. And this is to commemorate the 38. Now they say 40 because they include medicine bottle and Shakopee. And this is the largest limestone, one-piece limestone statue in the world. And it's there beside the public library.
Where is it?
Thank you very much,
Mhm.
John. Let's give him a round of applause.